In the early months of the Second World War, when the Atlantic was still the main theater for German naval operations, most officers of the Kriegsmarine carried in their minds an image of a navy that relied heavily on battleships, cruisers, and the silent menace of U-boats. Aircraft carriers were considered novel, perhaps useful in niche roles, but hardly the core of a fleet. The Royal Navy had carriers, but they were limited in size and number, and German officers tended to dismiss them as fragile vessels that required heavy protection. This perception began to shift when first-hand reports of American naval strength trickled into Berlin. At first, these reports sounded exaggerated. Submarine captains returning from Atlantic patrols described immense silhouettes spotted on the horizon. Ships larger than anything they had imagined. They were not mere carriers in the European sense, but floating fortresses that seemed to combine the mass of a battleship with the wings of an airfield. German naval intelligence received intercepted signals and reconnaissance photographs, but paper and ink did not carry the weight of reality. It was only when German officers had the rare chance to see these vessels themselves or study them after engagements that the shock began to set in. One of the earliest points of contact came indirectly through the experiences of U-boat commanders. They told of encounters where convoys, once thought vulnerable, suddenly had constant air cover, not from distant land bases, but from mobile platforms at sea. These carriers were not small auxiliary craft. They fielded dozens of aircraft that could scour the ocean for submarines, forcing U-boats to dive and hide. The balance of hunter and hunted began to tilt. For German officers trained in doctrines where submarines could strike convoys with relative impunity, the realization that convoys might now sail under a permanent aerial shield was deeply unsettling. Later, as the war shifted its weight toward the Pacific, German officers followed closely through intelligence exchanges with their Japanese allies. Reports from the Pacific carried a mix of awe and dread. Descriptions of the Battle of Midway, for instance, emphasized not only the tactical brilliance of the Americans, but also the sheer capacity of their carriers to project force over hundreds of miles. To German minds accustomed to Atlantic geography, where Britain was the central island fortress, the idea of naval air power extending across the breadth of the Pacific seemed almost unthinkable. Yet the Americans had made it reality. There were occasions when German prisoners of war, naval officers among them, were taken aboard American carriers for transport or interrogation. These men later recounted their experiences with disbelief. They spoke of hangar decks that stretched like cavernous cathedrals, packed with aircraft in neat rows. They described elevators rising and lowering planes as if by industrial magic, crews working with machine-like precision, and vast galleys feeding thousands of sailors in shifts. Compared to the claustrophobic quarters of a U-boat or even a German battleship, the carrier resembled an entire city adrift on the waves. The sheer scale of these vessels was perhaps the most shocking detail. German capital ships like the Bismarck and Tirpitz were enormous by European standards, yet they carried heavy armor and artillery rather than aviation capacity. An American carrier, by contrast, was almost as large but devoted its mass to air wings, fuel reserves, and the maintenance of constant flight operations. German officers could not help but note that one such vessel was the equivalent of several airfields moving in formation, capable of launching wave after wave of sorties. This vision undermined the very foundation of their naval doctrine, which had long been centered on decisive gunnery duels and stealthy submarine campaigns. Adding to the shock was the apparent casualness with which Americans deployed these giants. While the Kriegsmarine agonized over every sortie of its limited fleet, American carriers seemed to appear in multiple theaters at once. By 1942 and 1943, intelligence reports spoke of new classes of carriers being launched with industrial speed, each one larger and more advanced than the last. To German officers who had watched shipbuilding in Germany hampered by resource shortages and Allied bombing, the American ability to produce these floating fortresses appeared almost otherworldly. But beyond the statistics and raw dimensions, there was something psychological about the first encounters. German officers realized that the presence of a carrier changed the character of a naval engagement. A fleet escorted by a carrier had eyes that could stretch far beyond the horizon. It had claws that could strike submarines before they even lined up for a torpedo run. It had the flexibility to support landings, to disrupt enemy supply lines, and to dominate the skies wherever it sailed. For officers trained in the traditions of surface warfare, this was nothing less than a revolution at sea. It is no wonder that when German officers spoke of their first encounters with America's aircraft carriers, their words carried tones of disbelief. They had stepped into a new dimension of naval power, one that combined industrial might, technological sophistication, and strategic imagination. The floating cities they glimpsed were not just ships. They were a declaration of how the war at sea would be fought and, ultimately, won. To the German naval mind of the early 1940s, a warship was defined by its guns and armor. The grandeur of the Bismarck or the Tirpitz lay in their massive cannons, the thickness of their steel plating, and the prestige they carried as symbols of Reich power. Aircraft carriers, in contrast, seemed fragile, too reliant on planes that could be shot down or disabled by bad weather. Yet when the Kriegsmarine began to absorb intelligence about the American Essex-class carriers and their predecessors, they discovered something that defied their assumptions. These ships were not fragile auxiliaries. They were floating cities built to endure and to dominate. The floating city metaphor was not simply poetic. American carriers resembled industrial complexes laid across steel hulls, stretching nearly 3 football fields in length. German officers, when they first studied detailed descriptions, were astonished at the scale. Flight decks long enough to launch heavy bombers, hangars stacked with dozens upon dozens of aircraft, fuel stores that could sustain operations for weeks, and workshops capable of repairing damaged planes on the spot. These features gave the carriers a self-sufficiency that Germany had never imagined. To those trained in European naval traditions, the idea of a ship that could house and deploy an entire wing of aircraft seemed like science fiction turned reality. The design alone was shocking. Unlike the armored citadels of German battleships, carriers sacrificed heavy gun turrets in favor of vast runways and aviation infrastructure. At first, this struck many German officers as a reckless gamble. Why strip a warship of its primary weapons? But reports soon showed that the aircraft themselves were the weapons, more versatile and far-reaching than any cannon. A single carrier could launch reconnaissance planes to scout hundreds of miles in all directions, dive bombers to strike enemy ships, and fighters to defend the fleet against air attacks. The ship itself became a mobile fortress of aviation, redefining what naval power meant. Inside these vessels, the sense of a city at sea was even more striking. American carriers had vast mess halls feeding thousands of sailors, sleeping quarters that dwarfed those on German warships, and medical bays resembling small hospitals. Officers marveled at the inclusion of recreational facilities, gyms, barber shops, even movie projectors, luxuries unthinkable on a German cruiser or U-boat. The logic was simple, yet brilliant. A crew sustained by comfort and routine could endure long deployments and remain combat-ready far longer than men crammed into steel coffins. German officers who glimpsed these floating communities were forced to admit that morale, logistics, and human endurance had been engineered into the very design. Even the operational choreography impressed them. Elevators carried planes between hangar and flight deck with mechanical efficiency, while crews performed rehearsed routines that seemed like industrial ballet. Launching dozens of aircraft in quick succession, recovering them with precision landings, and preparing the next wave was a process perfected to near automation. In German ships, every major maneuver was dominated by officers and strict hierarchy. On American carriers, however, sailors themselves were empowered by training and systems to act decisively, producing a rhythm of constant motion. German accounts noted this as both alien and intimidating. Another point of disbelief came from the carriers' logistical autonomy. With their own machine shops, spare parts, and aviation fuel reserves, these ships could function independently of immediate shore bases. A carrier group could sail into remote waters and operate for extended campaigns without waiting for supply convoys. This capability was nearly inconceivable to the German Navy, which was bound tightly to European harbors and vulnerable supply routes. The Americans, by contrast, had created a war machine that carried its own lifelines, enabling strategic flexibility that seemed boundless. Perhaps most shocking of all was the scale of aviation capacity. Where British carriers carried a modest number of planes, American giants boasted air groups in the range of 80 to 100 aircraft. German officers, accustomed to thinking in terms of surface gunnery duels, struggled to process this reality. The comparison was staggering. A single American carrier could deliver the firepower equivalent of several airfields, moving wherever needed and striking targets that had thought themselves safe behind oceans. It was as if the Americans had learned to bend geography itself to their advantage. The floating city concept went beyond size. It embodied a philosophy of war. The Americans had chosen mobility, projection, and sustainability over brute force. They built ships that could carry not only weapons, but the infrastructure of an entire campaign. In doing so, they created a new kind of warfare where distance and isolation offered no protection. German officers, reviewing battle reports and photographs, confessed among themselves that the balance of naval power was shifting irrevocably. The age of the battleship was closing, and the age of the aircraft carrier had begun. In the quiet of post-war memoirs, some German naval officers admitted that they had underestimated the carriers until it was too late. They recalled the first time they saw images of these floating cities and realized that Germany had no answer to them. The Reich had gambled everything on U-boats and a handful of capital ships, while across the Atlantic, America had built an armada of moving airfields. The shock was not only in the steel and tonnage, but in the realization that Germany's naval imagination had been too narrow. For the men who had spent their careers worshipping artillery and armor, the American carrier was a revelation and a warning. It stood as proof that wars were no longer won by clinging to old doctrines, but by daring to reimagine the battlefield. To German officers, the floating cities of war were both terrifying and awe-inspiring, symbols of a new age they had not been prepared to fight. Life aboard America's aircraft carriers was, to German officers who heard or later saw it, nothing short of surreal. For men accustomed to the suffocating environment of U-boats or the Spartan routines of German surface ships, the American carrier represented another world, a city drifting across the sea with its own rhythms, comforts, and hierarchies. It was a warship, yes, but also a community, engineered to keep thousands of men not just alive, but effective through months of deployment. The more German officers learned about these ships, whether from intelligence reports, captured documents, or first-hand experiences as prisoners, the more they realized they were confronting something profoundly alien to their own traditions. One of the first things that astonished them was the sense of space. On a U-boat, every inch of steel was crammed with machinery, bunks, and torpedoes. The air was thick with diesel fumes, sweat, and anxiety. On German battleships, space was more generous but still rigidly functional. Narrow corridors, small mess halls, tight cabins. By contrast, American carriers spread out like floating towns. The hangar deck alone could have swallowed an entire U-boat and still left room for more. The flight deck stretched longer than most European streets. To walk from bow to stern was to take a journey. For German officers used to confined warfighting machines, this vastness seemed almost decadent. Then there was the matter of living conditions. Reports described mess halls where hundreds could eat at once, menus offering more variety than German sailors could dream of, and refrigeration systems keeping supplies fresh across weeks at sea. While German crews subsisted on hard bread, canned meats, and thin soups, American sailors lined up for hot meals that included fresh vegetables, eggs, and even ice cream. Prisoners who experienced these meals firsthand later admitted that the abundance was demoralizing in itself. How could Germany sustain morale and endurance when the enemy's sailors lived as if they were in a floating cafeteria rather than a steel cage? The carriers also contained medical facilities that German officers likened to small hospitals. There were surgical bays, wards for the wounded, and trained staff ready to handle not only battle injuries, but also illnesses that could sweep through large crews. For German sailors, medical treatment was often rudimentary, a ship's doctor improvising with limited tools. On the American carriers, medicine was industrialized, prepared for scale, and woven into the rhythm of war. This was not just a matter of comfort. It reflected a logistical depth that Germany could not match. A wounded sailor on a carrier might return to duty in days, while his German counterpart could linger useless or die for lack of proper care. Even recreation was built into the system. German officers were astounded to learn that carriers included gyms, barber shops, and spaces where films were projected for entertainment. These luxuries struck many as frivolous until they realized their purpose, keeping thousands of men sane during endless stretches of sea duty. By contrast, boredom and claustrophobia were constant enemies aboard German vessels, sapping morale and discipline. The Americans, with their emphasis on comfort, seemed to understand that war at sea was as much about endurance of the spirit as it was about endurance of steel. Order and discipline aboard these carriers also impressed the Germans, though in unexpected ways. German warships were governed by rigid hierarchy, with every action controlled by the authority of officers. On American carriers, reports described a more flexible style. Sailors were highly trained for specific tasks and empowered to execute them with speed and initiative. Flight deck operations in particular struck German observers as astonishingly efficient. Hundreds of men working in colored uniforms, directing planes, fueling them, arming them, and clearing decks in minutes. What might have seemed chaotic was in fact a carefully choreographed ballet of men and machines. German officers, with their preference for strict order, admitted that this looser American system somehow achieved greater precision. The psychological effect of all this could not be ignored. For German officers, the contrast was humiliating. They realized that their sailors fought under conditions of scarcity, discomfort, and relentless pressure, while American crews fought with the strength of abundance, backed by systems that cared for their needs and multiplied their effectiveness. The carriers were not just war machines, they were embodiments of American industrial philosophy, which held that human performance could be maximized by investing in the welfare of the worker. To German minds trained in sacrifice and discipline, this was both alien and disturbingly effective. There was also the sheer scale of coordination between different roles on the carrier. Pilots, mechanics, deck crews, gunners, cooks, doctors. Each was a cog in the larger machine. German officers who studied these ships remarked on how the entire carrier functioned like a small city-state, where each citizen had a place and a task. The warship was not just a vessel, but a society afloat, complete with its own hierarchy, culture, and routines. The sense of permanence and stability it conveyed was overwhelming compared to the fragile existence of German naval crews. For many German officers, the realization was crushing. They were facing an enemy who had built not only ships, but systems that sustained war in ways the Reich could not replicate. These floating cities revealed America's ability to blend technology, logistics, and human welfare into a seamless instrument of power. If Germany's warships symbolized steel will and defiance, the American carriers symbolized something larger, a civilization mobilized for total war. In post-war reflections, German officers confessed that the carriers left them with a sense of futility. How could they hope to prevail against a nation that sent to sea not just machines of destruction, but entire societies, complete with comforts and resilience? The floating cities were more than ships. They were proof that America could project not just firepower, but a way of life, and that this way of life was designed to endure the storms of war. If the size and living conditions aboard American carriers astonished German officers, the true shock came when they grasped the industrial power that had made such vessels possible. For Germany, every major warship was the product of years of planning, scarce resources, and fierce debates within the Reich's leadership. A ship like the Bismarck had been a singular achievement, requiring enormous expense and political weight. The Americans, by contrast, treated carriers not as rare treasures, but as items rolling off an assembly line. German intelligence reports from 1942 and 1943 spoke with disbelief of shipyards along the American coasts, launching carriers at a pace that defied imagination. Where Germany struggled to repair damage from Allied bombing and keep pace with U-boat production, the United States seemed to be laying keels for new Essex-class carriers as if they were merchant ships. Entire classes of vessels were being completed in months, not years. To officers who had fought through endless shortages of steel, oil, and skilled labor, these reports seemed exaggerated, almost propaganda, yet the reality was worse. America's industrial engine was simply overwhelming. The difference lay in scale and philosophy. Germany's war industry was fragmented, competing for Hitler's favor, often mismanaged, and chronically undersupplied. America's was centralized, coordinated, and fueled by a vast reservoir of raw materials. Carriers were built in parallel, not in sequence, with dozens of shipyards working simultaneously. German officers realized that even if one carrier were sunk, another would soon replace it. The sense of permanence was devastating. While Germany clung to every battleship as irreplaceable, America treated its giants as expendable in a greater flow of production. What particularly unsettled German strategists was the way these carriers embodied the union of democracy and industry. Sailors who ate well and lived with relative comfort were supported by an economy that had mobilized without collapsing. German officers knew how brittle their own system was, where shortages and rationing strained both civilian and military morale. In America, factories churned out ships, planes, and supplies, while civilians still enjoyed consumer goods and relative stability. It was as if the carriers themselves were physical proof that the Reich was fighting a nation whose resources and organizational capacity bordered on the limitless. To German naval minds, this industrial superiority meant that no tactical victory could truly shift the balance. Even if a U-boat wolf pack or surface raider sank a carrier, the Americans would simply replace it, and likely with a newer, larger, and more advanced version. The floating cities of war were not isolated achievements, but the visible tips of an industrial iceberg. For German officers, the recognition was bitter. They were not merely fighting ships, but the entire machinery of a continent-spanning nation. In the end, the shock was not just about steel and tonnage, but about time. Germany was running out of it, while America seemed able to produce more of everything with every passing month. Each new carrier launched was another reminder that the Reich's naval dream was doomed not by tactics, but by arithmetic. For German officers, steeped in doctrines of surface gunnery and submarine warfare, the realization that America's carriers carried not only vast crews, but wings of aircraft was disorienting. They had built their strategies around the power of battleships and the stealth of U-boats. Yet the carriers introduced a new reality. The ship's true weapons were not its steel or guns, but the squadrons of aircraft that could reach hundreds of miles beyond the horizon. The reports that filtered back from the Atlantic, and more vividly from the Pacific, described fleets that seemed to fight with invisible hands. Convoys, once safe beyond land-based air cover, now found themselves under constant threat. Dive bombers appeared suddenly, torpedo planes struck with precision, and fighters patrolled skies that had been assumed empty. German officers understood that these aircraft could scout, attack, and defend simultaneously, giving the Americans eyes, claws, and shields far beyond any traditional fleet. The scale of aviation aboard the carriers was staggering. Where British carriers might launch a modest handful of planes, an American Essex-class vessel carried close to 100. Coordinated into wings, these aircraft could strike enemy warships, hunt submarines, and even support amphibious landings. The effect was to expand the battlefield to a size the Kriegsmarine had never prepared for. Suddenly, no surface ship was safe, no submarine immune, and no coastline beyond reach. The tactical consequences became clear after early Allied landings supported by carriers. German officers saw how air wings neutralized coastal defenses before troops even approached the beaches. They saw how carriers protected fleets from the Luftwaffe, projecting American power over contested waters with relentless pressure. Each aircraft lost could be replaced, each wave launched without hesitation, because the carriers carried the industrial might of America within their steel decks. For German naval strategists, this was devastating. Their own doctrine of decisive surface battles collapsed when aircraft could sink a battleship before it came within range to fire. Submarines, once the terror of convoys, found themselves stalked from the skies. Even victories seemed hollow. Sinking one carrier was meaningless when replacements were already on the way. In conversations recorded after the war, German officers admitted that the carrier was the true revolution of naval warfare. It was not just a ship, but a floating airfield that bent geography and strategy to America's will. Where a battleship could dominate a patch of ocean, a carrier could dominate an entire region. For the Kriegsmarine, this was the most bitter lesson. The future of war at sea had arrived, and Germany had no answer. When German officers studied the Mediterranean theater, they found further proof of the carrier's transformative power. By 1942, Allied operations in North Africa and later in Sicily revealed how these floating cities could reshape entire campaigns. German and Italian forces had once relied on the narrowness of the sea, believing that shore-based aircraft and Axis naval assets could keep the Mediterranean under their watch. But when American and British carriers appeared, they extended the Allies' reach into waters previously thought secure. Reports of Operation Torch, the Allied landings in North Africa, deeply unsettled German officers. Carrier-based aircraft provided continuous cover for convoys carrying men and equipment across the Atlantic. Luftwaffe squadrons stationed in Tunisia and Sardinia found themselves harassed before they could even reach striking distance. German accounts noted that the Allies seemed to carry their own airfields with them, able to unleash waves of fighters and bombers wherever needed. For the first time, the Mediterranean was no longer a chessboard where the Axis controlled the air. The invasion of Sicily in 1943 reinforced the lesson. Carriers supported the landing forces by pounding coastal defenses, interdicting reinforcements, and shielding the fleet from counterattacks. German officers, who had long dismissed amphibious operations as vulnerable, now watched as carrier-based aviation made them not only possible, but overwhelmingly effective. The carriers created a protective dome under which troops could advance almost unhindered. Traditional defenses, designed for artillery duels and coastal batteries, simply collapsed under this aerial umbrella. Captured German documents from the Mediterranean front reveal a sense of desperation. Field commanders demanded more Luftwaffe support, but planes flying from European bases could not sustain the same tempo as carrier squadrons operating a few miles offshore. Every hour, American carriers could launch fresh sorties. Every day, they could maintain pressure without pause. German officers recognized this as the decisive advantage. Carriers compressed time and distance in ways Axis forces could not counter. In post-war reflections, some German naval officers admitted that the Mediterranean demonstrated what they had feared since first learning of America's carrier program. The carriers were not defensive shields, but offensive engines of conquest. They allowed the Allies to land where they wished, strike at will, and overwhelm local forces before they could react. To officers who once believed in the security of fortified coasts and narrow seas, the Mediterranean campaigns proved that geography had been rewritten. The carriers turned the Mediterranean into an Allied lake, their decks serving as mobile strongholds that no static defense could withstand. For German officers, the lesson was brutal and undeniable. Control of the sea no longer depended on battleships or shore guns, but on the dominance of floating airfields. While the Mediterranean exposed Germany to the direct power of Allied carriers, it was the Pacific theater that filled German officers with a deeper, more haunting dread. Reports flowed in through military attachés in Tokyo and intercepted dispatches. The Americans were waging a new kind of war against Japan, and the centerpiece was the aircraft carrier. To German strategists, watching from afar, it was like observing the future unfold in real time. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 became a case study. German officers read with disbelief that 4 Japanese carriers, once symbols of invincibility, had been destroyed in a single engagement. The Americans, using code-breaking, precise coordination, and relentless airstrikes, had proven that carriers could annihilate one another in battles fought entirely beyond the range of guns. For officers raised on the idea of the decisive surface clash, it was a stunning reversal. Naval combat had left the age of steel duels and entered an age of wings and flight decks. As the Pacific War raged on, German intelligence gathered accounts of the island-hopping campaigns. Each new island seized by the Americans was supported by carriers that brought their own airfields, eliminating the need for vulnerable construction under enemy fire. Japanese forces were pounded day and night by squadrons rotating seamlessly from carrier decks. German officers, reviewing these reports, understood the implications. If such methods were brought to the Atlantic, no harbor, no coastal installation, and no convoy would remain safe. Even more unsettling was the tempo of American operations. German reports highlighted how damaged carriers were repaired with astonishing speed, while new ones rolled from shipyards in a steady stream. Unlike Germany's rare and irreplaceable battleships, the Americans treated carriers as renewable assets in a greater system of war. This industrial resilience meant that even major losses did not slow their advance. To German officers, the lesson was clear. America could absorb blows and respond with greater strength, a nightmare scenario for any strategist. By 1944, when the Battle of the Philippine Sea showcased the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, German observers saw confirmation that American carrier aviation had reached a level of supremacy that no Axis force could match. Hundreds of Japanese planes were downed, while the American fleet remained largely untouched. German officers admitted among themselves that if the Kriegsmarine ever faced such power directly, it would be annihilated. The Pacific War became, in their minds, a mirror of what might come to Europe. German officers feared that one day these floating cities would sail into the Atlantic in overwhelming numbers, bringing the same ruin to German coasts that they had inflicted upon Japan. It was not just a tactical concern, but a psychological one. The carriers symbolized a kind of inevitability, proof that America's reach was global, and its power unanswerable. By the time the war drew to its close, the image of America's aircraft carriers lingered heavily in the minds of German officers. In post-war interrogations and memoirs, they often returned to the same word when describing them: unfassbar, incomprehensible. The carriers were more than ships. They embodied an industrial and strategic philosophy so far beyond Germany's reach that it left many with a deep sense of futility. Captured admirals admitted that their pre-war doctrines had been rendered obsolete almost overnight. The battleship, once the pride of the Reich, had been exposed as a relic. Submarines, though still deadly, could no longer dominate seas patrolled by carrier aircraft. Even fortified coastlines, in which Hitler had placed so much faith, seemed vulnerable when a fleet could bring its own airfields directly to the fight. Officers confessed that their training and imagination had failed them. They had prepared for the last war, not the one America was determined to fight. Personal testimonies revealed the emotional weight of this realization. Some officers described their shock at being transported aboard carriers after capture, walking decks so vast they felt like boulevards. They recounted hangars buzzing with mechanics, planes stacked in endless rows, and the hum of power that seemed inexhaustible. For men raised in a Europe shattered by scarcity, the abundance aboard these floating cities was demoralizing. It was a glimpse into a world where war was sustained not by desperation, but by overwhelming capacity. Post-war analyses within Germany also emphasized the symbolic meaning of the carriers. They represented America's unique ability to merge technology, economy, and human welfare into instruments of war. Each carrier was a statement that the United States could project force anywhere, at any time, with a self-sufficiency that nullified geography itself. To many former German officers, this realization was bitter, not just because it spelled defeat, but because it revealed the limits of the Reich's vision. Germany had gambled everything on old models of power, while America had redefined the very battlefield. In the years after surrender, memoirs published by naval officers often carried an undertone of awe. They acknowledged that no strategy could have matched the sheer momentum of American carrier warfare. The floating cities were, in their words, the handwriting on the wall, proof that Germany's naval dream had been doomed from the start. For these men, the carriers became symbols of inevitability. They were reminders that the war had been decided not only on the front lines, but in the factories, shipyards, and doctrines that had shaped its course long before the first shots were fired. To the German officers who had once believed in the supremacy of steel and willpower, the carriers stood as monuments to a new age, an age where the sea belonged not to the mightiest gun, but to the largest deck